I'm on now. God. We need a new person on the soundboard. You may keep talking so you can straighten that out. Testing. All right, that's a little better. Hello, hello. 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 Can you hear me now? We may be fixing the sound on the fly. I'm barely whispering right now. I am way louder than, I cannot talk at this level. It's not going to work. 5, 4, 3. Okay. Can I talk this loud? Is this too loud? It seems loud, but maybe it's just because I can hear myself talking in my ear. It is good to see everyone tonight. If you didn't do your homework, you don't know this, but we're in 1 Kings chapter 3 and 4. Next week, I'm really going to saddle you with a lot. You're going to have to read 5, 6, and 7. I know that'll be tasking for you to read 3 chapters of the Bible, but I want you to do that because we're going to kind of move through this thing a little bit. So a little bit of review from last week. Last week, we began in chapters 1 and 2. And we talked about Solomon's accession to the throne, or his ascension to the throne. And it was a violent one, a bloody one. We talked about how that would not be surprising. That would be very normal sometimes, especially if you have a change in dynasty, if you will, or competition between two rivals for the throne. And so, you know, we had Adoniah, who assumed he was going to be the king, and that was not what God's wishes were. And I gave you some homework, and several of you sent me a response. I did not know the answer to the question, and so that's why I had given it to you to say, where is it, or did Yahweh ever say that Solomon needed to take the throne? And many of you responded, several of you emailed and texted me, and I was excited to know that we do see in the book of Chronicles, in 2 Chronicles, we see where, in 1 Chronicles 28, we see where Solomon is the one who is supposed to build the temple and to take the throne. And I had mentioned to you last week about the rose-colored glasses of the chronicler and how he reports David and Solomon. Well, you know the chronicler is going to report that it is absolutely certain that Solomon was supposed to take the throne. Now, even some of you looked back into 2 Samuel and talked about how David said, hey, you're not going to build the temple, but your successor will. And so your son will. And so that had to be that, but which son? And so the chronicler straightens that out for us. And so those of you that looked that up, and it's great. Now I know the answer to that question. If I had known it, I've forgotten it from the last time I taught 1 Kings. But I appreciate you looking that up. And so definitely it was supposed to be Solomon, the second son, or the second child at least. We're not told that Bathsheba's first child is male or female, I don't think. I think it just says child. Died, and God said it was going to die through the prophet Nathan. But her second son, Solomon, is the one who took the throne. And after a little bit of elimination of rivals, Solomon seats on the throne. At the end of chapter 2, we see in verse 46, after Benaniah, the hitman, takes care of everybody, we see that the kingdom was established in the hand of Solomon. And so all the way through chapter 12, we're going to see Solomon as the king of Israel, about half this book. And a lot of the things that we will go over may be familiar to you. If they're not, that's okay. For example, tonight we're going to talk about a story that a lot of people know, but not everybody knows, in looking at this tale of two prostitutes and the division of a child. We will cover that very slowly and in detail, but we will also think about the clues it gives us to the mentality of people in the middle of the Iron Age in the ancient Near East, which is the time frame we are looking at here. So we're in the 900s, the early 900s. And when I say early, that means like 959 to 980 type neck of the woods. So we're early in the 10th century. And look at this. So this gives us a little bit of an insight. But we're going to see that Solomon is able to rule over a magnificent kingdom a very large kingdom. Now keep in mind, large is a relative term. His entire kingdom was about the size of West Virginia. And so we're not talking about a whole lot of territory. Even today, the modern day nation of Israel is really not that big when we look at it on a map compared to some of the states that we have in the Union. So we begin to look at this journey in chapter 3 on Solomon's life. And the author of 1 Kings tells us right off the bat that Solomon made a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Now, we're not sure exactly which Pharaoh this is. Here in just a little bit, later on in 1 Kings, we will encounter the first named Pharaoh in the Old Testament. And we think, man, it is strange to think that we don't have a Pharaoh of Egypt called by name. I wish we did, because it would certainly settle the late and early Exodus debate and give us some time frame on other things, because we know with a great deal of accuracy about the reigns of the kings of Egypt. But here, some people think may have been Pharaoh Simeon. We don't know for sure. But just as it is today in many cultures, and it has been maybe throughout the medieval period and the Middle Ages, kings don't necessarily marry for love and romance. You often will marry for political reasons, to make an alliance with a nation. You marry their daughter, or you send a daughter off or a son to be married to their children, and that puts an alliance. Sometimes you send away a son to be a hostage for those people, so you don't break a treaty, because if you break a treaty, I'll kill your son. We see some of that going on, I think, even in the life of one of the Herods. I can't remember if it was Herod Antipas or someone who sends a son to Rome kind of as a hostage. I may be misremembering that, but we see that throughout ancient world. And so he making an alliance, Solomon, with really a close by ancient power in Egypt, and he marries her daughter. Now, what's interesting here is we have this very, very start of his rule. He is already doing something that's unwise. Now, we have to keep in mind that Solomon does not really seem to marry, even though we wind up looking at him having 700 wives, at least 700 wives, and they're all princesses, and 300 concubines. The text tells us later on that we'll study that these are from nations around Israel, from the Hittites or from the Ammonites or the Moabites. Those are not Canaanite nations. Those are nations around Canaan. And so the Israelites were prohibited from marrying, and they didn't follow this rule, but they were prohibited from marrying into the Canaanites. But no matter who they married outside of Israel, the issue is they were going to be what we might call today someone who believes in many different gods. Having a polytheist, we might say. They have tens of dozens of gods. And we know that Pharaoh and Egypt worship a lot of different gods, and they did not worship Yahweh. And so whenever you make a marriage alliance with them, it's something that the kings were not supposed to do, is multiply wives for themselves. Deuteronomy tells them explicitly not to do that. But when you marry that, you make alliances with foreign nations, then you kind of become subject to that. And we're going to ultimately see, spoiler alert, that this is the downfall of King Solomon, that his foreign wives led him astray to worship foreign gods. Now, you're not going to see that in the Chronicles, but you see it here in what we had. And so he goes into construction. We have been talking in the Monday morning men's class about several different characters in the Old Testament. And we talked about Solomon, and this past week we talked about Rehoboam and Jeroboam. And we talked about building projects. And most ancient kings leaving a legacy behind of some great building construction or some awesome architectural achievement or some engineering achievement was your legacy and a great thing. It's why we call Herod the Great, is because he was a great builder, not because he was a great moral individual or a great follower of God, but he was a great builder. Caesarea Maritima on the coast of the Mediterranean off the coast of Israel was a beautiful construction. His tomb is a great construction. He was a great builder. His improvements to the temple in Jerusalem that was built 500 years before he came to power was a magnificent construction, a beautiful construction, greatly expanded the temple. And some of that construction stands to this day in the Western Wailing Wall that was not torn down by the Romans that Jews go to today and mourn and think about the temple. But we see that Solomon is going to be responsible for building the first temple in Israel, and that he's going to make many other construction projects. And in the very beginning of it, he has to build the Lord's house. He's going to build walls around Jerusalem, and he's also going to build a palace. And it's going to take him, I think, maybe a total of like 13 or 20 years or whatever it is to build this. There's an issue that people are still sacrificing in high places. Now, we see that mentioned often in the Old Testament. Even before now, we see people will be worshiping in high places. And we think about, why high places? Well, why would you worship in a high place? Meaning, why would you go up to the top of a hill or a mountain to worship deity? Hey, we might be closer to the gods. Keep in mind, your scientific worldview and the worldview of people in the Old Testament period and the New Testament period, for that matter, very different. You understand the Earth's atmosphere, and then what we would call space, and then the orbits of planets, and you understand that depth and how far out that goes. For them, there is this first heavens that we have here. Egyptians even believe, it was the god Amun-Ra who hauled the sun through the sky every day. That there's a realm outside of outer space does not register in their mind, but perhaps another heaven. Beyond that, there's a realm that the planets and the bodies move in. There's no comprehension that all of them are millions, if not trillions, if not billions of miles away, or even millions, if not billions of light years away. They don't have any comprehension of that that we do here. But high places are, and we'll get closer to the gods. We even think about Mount Olympus, so much later than this in Greek mythology. Closer to the gods, high places and mountaintops. And going to do it. So people all over Israel, that's where they go to worship even in sacrifice to Yahweh, because they're getting closer to God. His priorities, however, are the temple, the walls, and the palace. Now, Solomon goes and he is at Gibeon. And he goes to sacrifice there. It was a principal high place, we see, and he offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. And one night at Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night and says, ask me, we can insert the word me, what to give to you. Now, I can only imagine if I was in Solomon's place, what I would have asked for. Now, I'd like to kid myself and say that I would have asked for what Solomon asked for. I would have said, oh yes, Lord, give me the wisdom to guide your people and follow your laws. I don't know for sure if that's what I'd asked for. I may have asked for my enemies' necks to be under my feet. I may have asked for rich blessings upon my country, for peace, for our children to be born healthy, our crops to grow. There may be a lot of things that I may ask Yahweh for, but Solomon is very humble and starts out this very humble in what he asks for. And Solomon shows to God in verse 6 that you showed great and steadfast love to your servant, my father David, because he walked with you in faithfulness and righteousness, uprightness of heart. And now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in the place of my father David, although I'm only a little child. Now, this is interesting. Solomon was obviously not a little child at this time. He wasn't like, a 10-year-old or 8-year-old or something along those lines. He wasn't that. Why do you think, he said, I don't know how to go out or to come in. Now, I don't think we want to take that literally, that Solomon didn't know how to go out of a room and come into a room. But we think about the way that he uses this euphemistically, if you will. And we think about, what did Solomon mean when he said, I am but a little child who, we would say today in the South, don't know if I'm coming or going. That's how we might say it in our idiom. Well, what do you think Solomon meant by describing himself that way? He was new to the throne. What's that? All right, Garnett says maybe he's humble. In that way, it certainly is a humble thing to say, and children in the ancient world can be very humble. Maybe today children are not humble, but in a society where children were nothing but a commodity, they were probably a little more humble because they were not the most important thing in the family. What other things do you think about? Okay, he hadn't been a military leader like his dad. Now, he had been raised in a political environment. He had grown up in the palace. He was a child of the king. Solomon was extremely well educated, probably more educated than his father, but we don't know of any abilities he has as a leader of men in combat. Like his father David was highly respected for by everybody in the nation, right? More so even than Saul, the king, an experienced and successful military leader. That's a good point. I hadn't thought about that. What else? Yeah, I think that's a way to sum it up. I don't know what I'm doing. And so that's the truth. I'm like a little child. I'm new to this. Now, I'm new to being on the throne, but we got to be careful. He's not new to the throne. You know, he's new at sitting on the throne, but taking the position here, now you don't want to read too much into this, but I mean, taking the position is, I don't know, and I am asking you to give me the ability and discernment to know what I am doing. And so what he does is he takes the language of the least important person in society that wasn't blind or couldn't walk or had leprosy, and say, okay, I am just helpless, and I am of low status and low on the rung here. Now, he wasn't because of his upbringing, but I think he is being very humble. Somebody, I think Garnet said humble a minute ago in doing it. And boy, if Solomon had just stayed like this the rest of his time, how much better would the story be? Perhaps the kingdom wouldn't have divided. Perhaps we wouldn't see a complete absence of any king who sat on the northern throne that is said to do what was pleasing in the sight of God, and only about 3 or 4 that sat on the throne of Judah that did that. But that's a little bit more yet to come. But yeah, I think he's sitting there saying, I don't know what to do. I don't know what I am doing. And so the Lord replies to him and he says, because you've asked this thing and have not asked for yourself long life, that would be something I would probably have asked for, nor have asked riches for yourself, nor have you asked for the life of your enemies. I would have asked for that like right off the bat. But have asked for yourself discernment to understand justice. I underline that word because the king was responsible, any ancient Near Eastern king, was responsible to his people and to their gods to administer justice and keep things in order. And so the ability to do that is very challenging. And we're going to see that in the pericope we read about the prostitutes, because we are not living in a time here, they were not living in a time with DNA and security cameras. You know, you really didn't know something unless you had eyewitnesses. And as Johnny will tell you here, eyewitnesses are probably the least reliable thing you can have in any situation. Most attorneys will tell you that if people relied on my memory of anything that happened more than about 6 weeks ago, I would hope your life does not swing in the balance of me doing that testimony, because I really don't remember much of anything that happened that long ago in any kind of detail. But justice is a core important thing that has to be done because society has to be kept in order. That is very important for that. It's the reason that God asks children to honor their father and mother. He never tells children to love them, but he tells them they will respect and they will obey them. And it is important because society cannot function if that does not work and they don't learn to be within things. So justice is very important. I have done according to your words. You're getting that discernment. However, there's a bonus round. Behold, I have given you a wise and discerning heart, so that there has been no one like you before you, nor shall one like you arise after you. However, I have also given you what you have not asked for, both riches and honor. Can't think of anything more important than those two things in the ancient world. To have people respect Solomon. We're going to see that as we move through these lessons about Solomon. We're going to see that other foreign dignitaries come just to hear the wisdom of Solomon. And he is going to have an extreme amount of wealth, really about so much gold that he really doesn't know what to do with it. And what to do. I can find a lot of things to do with gold. So that there will not be any kings like you in all your days. If, however, there's the if statement. If you walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and commandments, as your father David walked, then I will prolong your days. We're going to see this formula given to Solomon several times, that there is a caveat. And we have to remember this even in our Christian walk as being part of the family of God, is that there are expectations on our side of the covenant. I was telling, I can't remember my Wednesday class or my Wednesday afternoon class or my Monday men's class, they all run together. I don't like when we mention somebody's baptized, and I'll tell you why. I want to know that they're saved, because I can be baptized and fall away. I can be baptized and go back to a life of like I lived before that and forget about God. I can be baptized 10 years ago and then turn into an agnostic or an atheist, and I'm not saved anymore. I want people to be baptized and live a life of faith where they are saved. And ultimately, on that great day of judgment, they are saved from going to hell, because that's what salvation is in the ultimate sense. But in order to do that, God has said, I am providing you the way. However, I demand obedience to my covenant like I always have. It's not a fire insurance policy to go through the waters of baptism. It's a fire insurance policy to go through the waters of baptism and live a life faithful to God and obey His statutes and commandments. And it's important for us to remember that every covenant with God's people has those parameters, and God always keeps His side of the covenant. And we have to keep our side of that covenant as well. We don't need to think I get baptized and I'm good for life, and I don't have to follow any rules, or I don't have to fulfill expectations. But James tells us that faith without works is dead, and a dead faith can't go to heaven. So there are caveats to Solomon's long life and what he has. And as we'll see in the long run, Solomon unfortunately does not honor that all the way. But it's an important thing. A very appropriate response to that, he comes out, he offers up burnt offerings and offerings of well-being, and provides a feast for all his servants. There we see in verse 15, after he woke up for this dream, and he stood before the Ark of the Covenant making those offerings. And so very appropriate to thank God and offer things to Him. And so then we come to Solomon's first test. In chapter 3, verse 16, we see that two women who were prostitutes come to the king and stand before him. And summarizing the story as we go through and think about it, I love this picture. I always like to find interesting pictures that are depictions of what things look like in the biblical days. Now, this is obviously painted sometime in the Middle Ages, because nobody dressed like that in Solomon's court. And one of the most interesting things is the dog at the bottom. I do not think that ancient kings probably kept dogs as pets as we do, or that maybe English kings did, because dogs were a filthy, dirty animal to Jews. They were an unclean animal, and they were scavengers. You know, they were what you fed Jezebel to. You know, this is not a household pet, but anyway, it's real beautiful and cute that we got a dog in the bottom of the picture. But this is meant to depict the two prostitutes who bring this baby before King Solomon. King Solomon's got a nice cropped haircut there. He looks pretty good. And so we see this, I say well known. I don't want you to feel embarrassed in here because you don't know this. But throughout Christianity and Judaism, this is a pretty well-known story. And so we have two prostitutes. You know what this tells us about Solomon's kingdom? The oldest profession in history is alive and well in the Solomonic kingdom here in Israel. There are prostitutes. And one good thing this tells you is that the economy was good because people had money to spend on prostitutes. But we have two prostitutes that come, and there is only one live child. Both of them have given birth to children, and the indictment or the accusation by one of them is that there has been some baby swapping going on. This woman over here had a baby. I had a baby. This woman had a baby. But she rolled over, or something happened in the sleep. She was sleeping with the baby, and the baby died. Now, this is not hard to believe in a place where the infant mortality rate was probably greater than 50%, and only about half the children lived to see their 10th birthday. But this baby died, and this other woman, who seems to be a moral princess, right, goes and swaps babies with the other woman. Now, I have always found this very interesting, and I talked about this when we went over Solomon, is I love women have a power to be able to discern that a infant that was born 15 and a half seconds ago looks like the father or the mother. Have you ever been at the hospital? Oh, it looks just like his daddy. You know, when Presley was born with this just gigantic cone head and looked like a lizard with slop all over, I didn't want it looks just like her daddy. I'm like, no, I don't have a cone head. You know, I don't look like that at all. But women have the ability to discern that this child who looks like 1,000 other babies in the nursery looks like her daddy. Now, that's a talent that we men don't have. Most of the time we can't tell somebody until they get to be like 12 years old. I don't know how in the world, you know, this woman thought that this woman was not going to recognize her baby. Now, especially when it is your baby. I think women have an ability to discern that and the bond with their children that is incredible, even in the ancient world. But this woman thought she was going to pull this off, and so she swaps the dead baby and takes the live baby. And obviously, we need to have justice administered here. And so one of the issues you have, as I mentioned earlier, we don't have any witnesses, right? There's no witnesses to this. This story is told for a reason. Do I think this is the only time Solomon ever had to make a wisdom decision or a justice decision? Surely not. Not in 40 years on the throne do we think this is the only time he had to do it. But you look at this story and why it's so important, and I think why the Holy Spirit wanted it in the Bible is there's no way to figure this out. Okay, and we have two witnesses here, both of them who have terrible credibility. We are not talking about people who are running a food kitchen here and the salt of the earth. Well, maybe they are the salt of the earth, but not the kind of salt you want here. We're not talking about people that are upstanding individuals and running charities around Solomon's kingdom. We're talking about a couple of prostitutes here, and there's no other witnesses. It's impossible. The text is telling us that in a sublime way. There's nobody else. Nobody was watching the nursery camera and saw them swap babies. Nobody else could be here. So it's her word against her word, and the baby isn't talking. He can't act as a witness. So there's also a complete lack of credibility. It's not as if one woman's a prostitute and another woman's the ancient Mother Teresa, okay? And both of them lack any credibility because of the livelihood that they have. So it's a perfect scenario for Solomon's discernment to be demonstrated that only a man with wisdom from God is going to come up with some sort of solution for this. Now, those of you that read the story, and those of you that hadn't, I encourage you to go back and do it. Solomon's proposal is somewhat disquieting to us in what he proposes. And what is it that he proposes? Cut the baby in half. Now, one of the people you read about is like, what if somebody called his bluff on that? Well, one of them did. You know, one of them said that go ahead and cut the baby in half. Now, it seems preposterous to us that Solomon would even mention this in a very, very harsh test. Here, what if both women said that? What if both women said, okay, Solomon would kind of have to be bluffed out probably. I hope that he would be. But he says this, and we get two different answers in the text. We have some of your text in chapter 3, verse 27 will say, the first woman said. Now, that is an additional word added to the text. It's not there in Hebrew. It's also not there in the Septuagint Greek. But the author is trying to make sure you understand it's the first woman that spoke previously, when the one who came with the accusation to do this. And so the first woman says, no, no, no. She's identified as the one who had the child. No, 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 don't do that. Let her have the baby. And Solomon says, hey, okay, that's the mama right there. That's because the other one says, go ahead. Now, you know what else this tells us? It tells us, it gives us a little bit of insight and glimpse into the value of human life and children in the ancient world. Now, I would like to think, now I may be wrong about the people in this room. I know most of you are really, really good people, maybe except Scott. Everybody's a good person in here. I don't think any of us, even if we weren't involved in this situation, would ever want a baby to be cut in half. I don't care if it was the baby of our worst enemy. If it was the baby of the most diabolical criminal that had ever walked the earth and had a baby, and we would say, cut that baby in half. You know, we would never agree to that, but we have a value. You know, I believe there's people in this world who may have said that. There's places in this world where children and human life is not thought about that way. But there's no way that anybody in their sane mind would say that. But what that tells us is just how debased some people's minds were towards human life in that ancient world. And so anyway, he said, all Israel had in verse, he gives it to the mother. All Israel in verse 28 heard of the judgment that the king had rendered, and they stood in awe of the king because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to execute justice. Now, can you imagine the confidence that gave those people in Solomon? We know that Yahweh is giving our king wisdom. And you can't imagine anything greater than that, right? For our king has got a connection to our God. That means we can trust in the judgment of our king, and everybody's going to get behind that.
Rewind just a little bit.
Okay, you be right.
Because the first woman also believed he would cut the baby.
I think maybe you're right. Johnny said that the first woman actually believed he would carry through with this remark.
He carried out his commandment, if you set foot outside of your house, I will kill you.
Yeah.
And then when he set foot outside of his house, that was it.
Yeah.
So while it seems brutal in the previous chapter, we see how that, he does what he says he'll do. And if he says, bring me a sword, I'm going to cut this baby in half, because we've seen that he'll already do what he says he's going to do. The first woman is like, oh my gosh, he's going to get a sword and cut my baby in half. So I think that also kind of plays into it, that he had credibility.
Okay, I know not everybody could hear that, but I'm going to summarize what you were saying is because Solomon had killed people before when he gave them boundaries and they violated these, what Shimei is the guy you're talking about, is that he stepped outside of the limits that he was given by Solomon. He killed him, that perhaps these people knew Solomon was the man of his word. And if he said he was going to cut this baby in half, he was going to cut the baby in half. And the woman who actually had the child believed 100% that Solomon would carry that out. I think it's a very valid point. And I think there's no question in my mind she believed that he was going to do that and cut the baby in half. And that tells us a little bit about what people think kings are willing to do and how they mean what they say. And so that's a good point. Wisdom is something that we throw around today as a word, and we often talk about wisdom being knowing what to do in situations because of what we bring to the table, of knowledge, of life experience, of failures and successes in our life. And a great deal of that is true, but for ancient peoples, wisdom was highly respected. You know, we see that when, for example, we think about the elders at the gates of cities, or we see people go to wise older people for decisions. Wisdom was highly valued. Divine wisdom was the ultimate gift. To have wisdom given by divinity to someone, we'll go see throughout the books of the Kings here. We won't study 2 Kings, but if you study it, you'll see that the prophetic word, there's a lot of prophets that get involved in things and bring messages from God. Wisdom was a big deal. We see that in books of wisdom, for example, like Ecclesiastes and the Proverbs. We have Proverbs by a lot of different people. I'm not one of those who believe that Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes, but it is full of wisdom. And we sometimes lump Job into that. Wisdom is cherished by ancient people, and for Solomon to have that is a tremendous gift. And I pray that we pray for the wisdom of God. And not just on our leadership, as we often do, but in everyone that ourselves and everyone that we encounter. And so Solomon, as we move into chapter 4, we see Solomon had a pretty large government. Those of you who don't like big government probably wouldn't have liked Solomon very much. But he did have, we think, around 12 districts. There's 12 different managers, if you will, that are named here. I know the beginning of chapter 4 is that part of the Bible where you really don't like to read it because it's a bunch of names and things that kind of all run together in your mind, but it was important to know those things. And so he has about 12 different districts there to bring tribute to the king. They supply him with measures of food, and we'll talk about that just here in a minute. In verse 7 of chapter 4, Solomon had 12 officials over all of Israel who provided food for the king and his household. Each one had to make provision for 1 month in a year. And we're going to see that was a lot of provision to make for the king. And so there existed taxation in the ancient world. It's how governments operated then. It's how governments operate now. Coinage was not something that was is known in this day and time as perhaps we might see in the Greek and Roman world. In that day, a shekel is not a coin. A shekel is a unit of weight. And so people may trade in silver or other precious metals, copper, gold, food, other food items, and things that you might have in trade, in a heavy trade. I've got a commodity that you need. You got a commodity that I need. For example, if you got gold and I've got timber, I'll take gold for my timber. In doing that, but not, coins where we have like the King Solomon's head stamped on it, or in Yahweh we trust written on the outside of them. You may have had nuggets of gold, pieces of things along those lines, some things that may have people had traded in that time. What we definitely see is this fulfillment of a promise to Abraham, and it's really to this time that we see that we really see Israel established as a nation. And as a country that matters, and an organized government that is substantial and not fragmented, not a tribal confederacy that we might see in the time of the judges, but a unified nation that controlled trade routes, that made alliances with other people, that operated like an ancient kingdom would do, and had things that they sold to people and things that people sold to them. They get great respect from people around them. Solomon's highly respected. And in chapter 4, verse 20, it says, this is interesting to read. Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand by the sea. Obviously, that is an exaggeration that we would have. But it's interesting that the author says Judah and Israel. And what that tells us is that the author was definitely living in a time where there was the kingdom was divided. And we know that. I mean, the book of 1 Kings, we're going to see the kingdom divided just here in a few chapters, but frequently we see that. In Solomon, if you got maps in your Bibles, it's neat to go to. We'll see that he's got a kingdom that stretches all the way to the river. Many of your translations will say Euphrates, because that kind of was the river. To the land of the Philistines, even to the border of Egypt. They all brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. And so the royal portion that we see for Solomon seems extravagant, but keep in mind, Solomon is not just feeding himself and a few, 4 or 5 other people. He probably has great feasting and is feeding a great many different people in the kingdom. So they're very well fed. He has brought a core that we see here that has brought to him 60 cores of meal and 30 cores of choice flour. A core was about 6 bushels or 56 gallons. That's not terribly exact, but roughly in doing that, so we can think about that's a lot for one day. Can you imagine 30 cores of choice flour a day? I can't imagine using a 5-pound bag of flour in a day. Certain restaurants use way more than that, but I mean, it's a lot of people to feed if we think using 30 cores, and a core being 56 gallons a day. We also see that he has some meats a day, 10 oxen, 20 grazing cattle, 100 sheep, plus other wild game that are listed here, and fowl. We have deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fatted fowl. So birds. He has got all these things being brought to him. That tells me he was feeding a lot of people, and he ate very, very well. And for the king to eat well wouldn't be unusual for anyone. Now, the only problem is when the king eats well and nobody else eats well. But he also has an interesting military strength. Here there is some issues with the text in verse 26 of chapter 4, that he also had 40,000 stalls of horses. Now that number seems extravagant, and it is. We see that in 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 26, it's more like 1,400 or 1,600 horsemen. 4,000 stalls is what's listed in the Greek text in the Septuagint, the LXX there. The Masoretic text has about, I think, 1,400 or 1,600. I have to go and look. I think 40,000 is probably a mistyped and bad copy. There is one Hebrew text that has 4,000. That makes more sense with the numbers that you see other than that. And so remember, that may be a copyist thing. Many of you may have a footnote in your Bible about that, so I wanted to mention there that there is some issues with that. He has 12,000 horsemen listed here. So a huge amount of things. You can also look over in 2 Chronicles chapter 9, verse 25 for some similar numbers along those lines. One of the interesting things that the king of Israel, and this mentions 12,000 horsemen. To stop and pause here, In chapter 17 of Deuteronomy, Yahweh knew that Israel was going to ask for a king over them. He had the infinite wisdom to know that one day Israel is going to ask for a king. Even though I don't want them to ask for a king, they will ask for a king. And even when the Israelites went to Samuel, the judge, and said, we want a king over us like other nations, he's like, be careful what you ask for. You are rejecting Yahweh as king over you. But Yahweh had made provisions for this day because he knew it was coming. There were some rules for the kings of Israel, both of which I don't think Solomon carried out. The first one is that they are to write for themselves a copy of the Torah, what we would call, I don't know where the name Pentateuch is manufactured from. It does mean, it has 50 there, or 5 at the beginning of it. But Torah is the correct name for what we call the Law of Moses, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. And the king was supposed to write for himself a copy of that. So that tells us that the king was literate. The king had the ability to write and to read. And the priests were going to check his copy to make sure it was good. And so we know that he was supposed to know the Torah of God. And if you write something down, can you imagine copying the first 5 books of the Bible by hand? That's hard enough if you have a ballpoint pen. Can you imagine doing it by lamplight in the ancient world? The other thing that the king was not supposed to do, or the other things, is to multiply wives for himself. Well, Solomon violates that. And to have for himself many chariots and horses. Well, Solomon does that. There's no reason to have chariots in Jerusalem. Now, I know Don has been to Jerusalem several times. Some of you others have been here, have been to Israel. There's no use for chariots around Jerusalem because Jerusalem is up on a what? It's up on a mountain, isn't it, Don? Chariots are used on wide plains, but it does show military strength and power, and many of their enemies they would have had to fight down on the plains, but not up around Jerusalem. He's also not supposed to multiply for himself silver and gold. Now, I don't have a problem that Solomon has a lot of riches because God says, I'm going to give you riches. So if God chooses to give him that, then he has that. But God did not choose for Solomon to multiply himself wives and for this military strength that he displays here towards the end. We've got a couple of minutes left. And so we also see towards the end of this thing, as we look at beginning in 31 or 30, it says, Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people of the East. That's a big statement. And all the wisdom of Egypt. That's a big statement. We think about how ancient Egypt was and how much wisdom existed in Egypt. We can't build pyramids today with the finest of cranes that we have. They figured out a lot of ways to do things. A lot of wisdom in Egypt, very ancient. Wiser than Ethan the Ezrahite and Heman, Kolkal, Darda, the children of Mahol. We don't know who these people were, but the readers of the King's book must have known. His fame spread throughout the surrounding nations. He composed 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. Now look, that's not a made-up number. Anytime you see an odd number in the Bible, take notice of it. They may round numbers every once in a while, but that number is an exact number. That's not an accidental number. I would have just said 1,000, or I would have said 1,100, but I would have said 1,005. He speaks of trees, from the cedar that's in Lebanon to the hyssop that grows on the wall. He would speak of animals and birds and reptiles and fish. People came from all nations to hear the wisdom of Solomon. They came from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom. We had an interesting question posed in the men's class on Monday morning a couple weeks ago. We were talking about Solomon, and I think it was Garth Crownover that asked this question. He was like, if Solomon knew all these things, didn't he know germ theory? Why didn't he tell people to wash their hands? And I said, well, what would he have done if he knew about germs, right? If he knew all this medicine, if he knew all things. And it was an interesting question, I think a very valid one, is how expansive was his knowledge? Well, even if Solomon had understood germs, what would he have done about it? And Garth said, well, he told people to wash their hands more often. And I said, I think these people are a little bit tougher when it came to germs than we are. We're not talking about people who live in a world with hand sanitizer. A little bit tougher people than we have here. But I thought it was an interesting thought in considering, even though we kind of joked about it in class, I thought it was very interesting that how much did this guy know about botany and zoology and the things that he was telling people were obviously amazing things that other people didn't know about animals, and writing these songs and coming from around that and looking at reptiles and fish. And it was just amazing that he would have this sort of knowledge. In chapter 4, verse 25, we see an idiom, if you will. So Judah and Israel, again, we see Judah and Israel separated, so we know the perspective of the author of 1 Kings, lived in safety, every man under his vine and his fig tree, from Dan even to Beersheba, all the days of Solomon. Now, when we think about a man under his vine and his fig tree, we don't typically refer to prosperity and peace and being well fed in that way. But I remember there was a politician in the United States that would say, a chicken in every pot, right? You guys have heard that. Meaning everybody has something to eat, everybody is doing well, being well fed, the economy is stable, people got plenty of food to eat. That's what that statement means that we see in verse 25. And so next week, if I can get my thing to flip here, there we go. Taxing, but read 1 Kings chapter 5 through chapter 7. I hope you're all blessed with a wonderful week. They're fixing to ring the bell on me, so I got to wrap up. But have a wonderful rest of the week, and we look forward to seeing you on